Cool. So I'm here as well to talk about self-sovereign identity. I don't have prepared slides. Usually I start with talking about all like what's identity, KYC, all the things. But I think given it's like late in the afternoon and we talked about this all day, I will skip this. The focus I want to bring into the conversation is the connection into like the smart contract world. And that's part of what we're doing. A little bit of background to Consensus. We are a company focused on Ethereum as an underlying platform. The founder from Consensus is Joseph Rouven. He's one of the co-founders from Ethereum. And he started building an ecosystem like for the Ethereum space of tools and applications around this. The company is only 3 years old and we have now 700 people. The majority of the people are working on different products. We have like about 45 different projects already, from supply chain to poker platforms to energy platforms, music, all kind of like everything which you can think about on use cases. We do most of it. But we do also like consulting. That was born because I think the market was like really asking for questions, or had lots of questions. So we're doing this as well. We actually opened our office here around the corner, I think a few months ago. And we do venture investment into ideas which are in this decentralized identity, or sorry, in this decentralization space. But and then we noticed that there's like just not enough people who really understand to write smart contracts. So we started our own academy and start to train people. So we had already like hundreds of people going through this training to understand how to write smart contracts. And because identity is so important for all of these use cases, uPort is one of the like early companies which were born in Consensus. The uPort team is now 23 people, and so we're building all kind of things around identity in that space. The way how we think about identity and blockchain is there are two challenges, and I think everything we talked about here today was mainly around using a blockchain as a trust anchor to build an identity system. So what Evernym and others are doing is building an identity solution using the blockchain. But the other part, which is also very important, is you need some form of identity to interact with blockchains. So I think many people, when you think about this, how do you know who the other person is if you interact with a smart contract? So with Bitcoin, it doesn't matter because you just have an address and a key and you just transfer money or like Bitcoins from A to B, and it doesn't really matter who the other person is. But with a lot of the use cases on these platforms, you need to have an understanding what kind of smart contract you're about to sign. So the users need to handle private keys, otherwise no blockchain, if you cannot be able to give people private keys. And if people are about to sign something which is really immutable on the blockchain, they better understand what they're about to sign. And I think that's something which often is like kind of like is a detail we need to figure out. But if people don't really trustworthy understand that the smart contract they're about to sign with a key is transferring a certain asset or make an agreement of any kind, it's really, I think, a key part to get this right. Generally, the friction to use platforms like Ethereum, because you need gas costs, is something which is also like not easy. So one of the other things we're working on is like to make it end-user friendly to interact with blockchains in general. So, and I think the most important part where we come in is now we started as a tool to use Ethereum. And now, because the lack of like, okay, you just as address and you can use this tool, now the combination to combine this with real-world trust anchors. Yeah. So what I think the Evernym team talked about, getting attestations issued from any like reliable third parties and combining them and being now able to prove them in a reliable form to an Ethereum smart contract. That's kind of the focus we have. The use cases, as I mentioned, whether it's now an Airbnb, Uber, all these kind of use cases require some kind of reputation. You need to know that the other person is actually reliable. And today we have these companies, the eBays and the Ubers and others, who take this role of building a reputation and solving this for us. But it's a really key point to make a lot of these use cases really useful. So we're working on a journalist platform within Consensus. We're doing a real estate tokenization platform. Open law is one of the other ones, which might be interesting for this group here, where you basically connect smart contracts and legal contracts. And all of them require kind of like, you need to know or have an idea about your counterparty. Yeah? Because otherwise, if it's just an address, there's always the risk that someone might give you the wrong address or assign them to something, and how do you prove that it's actually the right person? So this combination is where we focus on. The other part is many companies now explore private chain integrations. Yeah? So big banks or any other companies with a supply chain, often they say like, okay, we have private chains, but ultimately, who's controlling the keys? If you want to have a use case where the end users actually hold the keys and are actually in control of whatever the assets is, then you need to make it really user-friendly for them to do this. And I think that's often the problem. So what we built is also like the ability that you can onboard people onto the uPort identity and then use this for private chain signatures. So as a company, at the moment every company, every bank goes through the process of enrolling their users again and again. If you in the future can think about this, that you have something which is like your browser and you enroll once, and then you can use these keys to sign even transactions within private chains. So what we like, the way how we approach this is slightly different than people or other competitors. We're going a little bit more bottom up instead of top down. So we're not going to governments and big banks to start issuing these attestations. We're trying to find partners who represent a certain level of trust, because we're focused on the Ethereum market, and they're in the most simple ways. They just need to know that it's a real person, or that this is not someone coming 1,000 times at the same time. So anti-Sybil and other things are like very simple use case in the beginning. And what we see is now we launched a project in the city of Zug in Switzerland, where they just wanted to experiment getting people like in true self-sovereign identity solutions. And so the registration office, you create this, there's nobody else involved besides yourself. You go then to the registration office, they check your password, and they attest to you that you're actually the person who you claim to be. And then we noticed like weeks later, like lots of projects came to us like, hey, can we use this as a form of KYC? Yes, that's not a full KYC, and I'm not trying to explain like people here are aware what KYC is, but at least it's a first step in a more trustworthy interaction. And if you then use it on certain platforms over time, you can really build some form of reputation with us. So we really going from this Ethereum market and want to grow with the Ethereum market rather than going into immediately government and KYC use cases, because I think it's really hard. So in terms of technical things, just briefly, we use at the moment the Ethereum blockchain, and we use IPFS as like the technical underlying solution. So Sovereign has a trust framework, like it's a governance model, which has a certain number of stewards to maintain this. So and we are using at the moment the public blockchain, which has its benefits and its weaknesses by having a completely permissionless environment. Because we were from the beginning designing for a public blockchain, we always try to minimize the footprint on the blockchain. Not only like, of course, no personal information on the blockchain ever, that's clear, but let's say also like, where do you really need the blockchain? So we have a slightly more simplified approach, I think, than some of the competitors, that you have maybe just a handful of identifiers. So there is a certain level of correlation possible if you want to, but it makes it way easier for people to actually understand that they might have a legal identity, they might have a gaming identity, and maybe others, and it's up to them to choose this or being completely anonymous. So, but that's something where we work together with a lot of the partners in the ecosystem to see what's the right balance. I think interoperability is like one of our core objectives. Then the other very important part is like, how do you recover your keys? So we're experimenting with different things. Like last year, we launched something where we called it's an identity recovery rather than a key recovery. And the main thing what we did is we used two smart contracts. One is representing your identity or an identifier on the blockchain. And the second one was a smart contract which had a certain logic in there which allowed you to recover through your social network, not the keys, but the access to this identity. And how that works is basically the smart contract, for example, contains 5 delegates, and each of them, 3 out of 5 or whatever, would need to send a transaction to the smart contract, and then would flip the ownership of this identity to a new private key. And that's just one of these experiments. At the moment, there's some privacy implications because you can see in the smart contracts who are the other identities, but we have some ideas how we want to mitigate this. So I'm almost done. So the first thing people can see, so we have built a mobile application, but that's just more or less on the surface. You can do it already like now, it's in the App Store. You can download it, you can do this traditional like login with Facebook kind of style. You can sign transactions, you can have this private chain. This is all already in there, and lots of features are coming soon. But our focus at the moment, because we want to really make it super easy for applications around us to integrate it. So there's a lot of focus on building libraries to make it easy. We build services in the background to make it easy for paying gas costs. So the user doesn't even see that there are keys involved. The user doesn't see that there's any ether paid to create the identity. We stripped all of this away and allowed this to happen in the background. In the future, we will likely as well enable now companies, if they want to fund people using their platforms, that these applications can basically pay the transaction costs for them. Yeah, I don't go into details. I'm happy to do this, and that's just around key management, backup services, and so on. And we will talk now in the Q&A. Really, like for us, it's super important to work on open standards because I think it's so early stage, all of this, that we really emphasize a lot of the collaboration here with the community, as mentioned earlier, with the WCC and the Decentralized Identity Foundation in the Ethereum space. So yeah, that's the quick intro, and now we go to Q&A.
Do we have one more mic?
Yep.
Great.
Okay.
So much to talk about on identity, but I wanted to focus on one specific thing, which is identity interoperability. Right? So the thing about self-sovereign identity, or self-assigned names, however you want to think about it, is theoretically the individual is completely in charge of their stuff. But when you want to use the identity, you need kind of attested claims. What's the word I'm looking for? Credentials, right? Attestations that somebody else makes that are signed. And in theory, these things ought to be property that belong to you, the user, even though they were signed by some third party. Make sense so far? Here we have the Evernym approach. Here we have the uPort approach. So my question I wanted to put you guys on the spot about is, am I going to be able to take an attested claim from sovereign compatible systems to uPort compatible systems and back again?
Okay, I'm happy to start. So I think there are multiple components in this whole stack. I think when you think about this, the first thing what you need is an identifier which is like cross-blockchain possible. So we call it the DID, is a decentralized identifier, which you can register on Ethereum, on the sovereign chain, whatever. That's kind of the same language. We at least understand who you are. Yeah,
and this is essentially a key pair plus some metadata. Is it any more complicated than that?
Little bit.
Little bit.
I mean, it's going to have an identifier. You'll have some keys. You can have multiple keys. You can have some service endpoints. But it's a spec that we've been working with uPort and others on to make. I mean, it's the de facto standard right now for decentralized identifiers.
Yeah, so I think this identifier is the first part, and the second thing is then how do you log in, or like how do you present this, and like that's what we call this DID auth. That's I think where we're working on the same now. We don't want to have like another 5 buttons on login with sovereign and uPort and other things. It needs to be hopefully one last thing to replace it, and I think that's something which is also easy to standardize. I think the next level is like how do we enable the protocol of the communication. I think that's where we just started.
So the hope is that the DID is the last name that I need. Right?
Well, you have multiple DIDs, and so, but it's like a phone number, though. I mean, when you look at your phone, you don't think of the phone number when you call someone. You see their name, and so who cares what the big 128-bit
here's your big
number
number.
is?
So let's go back to pragmatics of interoperability, right? If we get a set of entities like banks that are willing to sign off on signing your passport. So you can put an image of your passport into your wallet, this kind of stuff, right? How are we going to make sure that we don't wind up with 75 different technical standards and the bank's just saying, sod it, and winding up with essentially a Microsoft-type solution, right? Because in the long run, if we don't have a standards-based approach, Google, Microsoft, Oracle, Salesforce, Facebook, SAP, depending on what space you're in, we might wind up in a position where we just wind up with a balkanized identity infrastructure rather than interoperability. What are the choke points on ensuring that we wind up with global interoperability, and how do we, as the kind of blockchain community, defend those choke points?
Well, there's a couple of paths. You mentioned, Rouven mentioned DIDs and DID auth. That's a good start. We also have the W3C Verifiable Credentials Working Group, which is also a good start. And there's a number of changes that we're going to be proposing that will make it easier for people using Sovereign to interop with other people in other ecosystems.
Yeah. I think we reached now, as part of the WC, the three elements already in terms of like the data format. What I think the last missing piece is really like how do we communicate between us. I think what we see the WCC is one component, because of the concern of like, okay, if we don't get on the same page, this motivated 50 companies over the last 12 months to come together and form the Decentralized Identity Foundation, where we're actually both founding members. Yeah. And we have now not only a bunch of startups who nobody might care about, but we have now Accenture, Microsoft, IBM, and Intel as like the big names in it. All the ones which are not the Facebook and Googles are interested actually to build something which could work. Yeah. So we are kind of like teaming up, finding...
So the players that don't have a billion people's identity on their books,
yes,
are attempting to form something up.
And the data.
So this is the rallying point. Decentralized Identity Foundation is where the action is going to be?
It's a meeting place, and it's a starting point, and who knows where it goes from here.
Yeah, I think it is, because there's a lot of concerns about like, oh, there's yet another standard body. I think the idea is that brings us together, and we talk about this. If there's other place which is a better suited one, because WCC or IETF or something else, we don't want to replicate this. We're happy to give this to someone else, and at some stage, I think this will be a group of coming together, harmonizing of our thinking, and then we find the right place to really standardize it. That's kind of the idea.
There's something quite interesting here that, back in the day, IETF type standards just applied on the internet. And now we're getting into a position where whatever is done by, in terms of standardizing blockchain identity is immediately going to smear across into finance and possibly into governance. Particularly in poorer countries, if you have things like land registries, which have a substantial blockchain component, the obvious expectation is you're going to wind up with the same identity used for land registry, voting, and commerce. Right?
Can I comment?
Yeah, please.
So
please.
I think of there's identity with a little I and identity with the big I. So identity with the big I is where I get to, it's really everything that I have about me that I get to control. Identity.
The philosophical identity.
Right.
Rather than the transactional identity.
Right. And the identity with the little I is the identity, it's a facet of my identity that I share with you or share with Rouven. That's an identity with a little I, and I could use that identity for land records, but I could also leverage the certificates or credentials I get from my land ownership in another context.
Right, so you use the land as the anchor. I mean, one of the companies I'm working with is Impact PPA, and they have this notion of using smart meters as identity verification devices. Because you know exactly where the smart meter is. So if you walk up to the smart meter and bang it with your phone, we now know very certainly where you were and when you were there. And that has all kinds of utility. But I want to go back a minute to this notion of the kind of big I, little I identity, philosophical identity, transactional identity. Surely the purpose of capitalism is to have transactional identity completely represent philosophical identity. I'll just leave that there. Is this handbag really me? So, last thoughts on this before we wrap up and hand the stage to the infamous Ian Grigg, who's responsible for far more of this than he'd ever admit to. So, what happens in a few years if it all works? Give me some notion of how my day-to-day life changes if the identity revolution that you're working on succeeds.
Well, yeah, I think when we talk about the possibilities, it's really, you got very philosophical and very crazy. I think once people have the ability to prove who they are and digitally confirm this, I think it will change so many business processes. It allows not only that you have way less friction in anything, like whether it's or onboarding, like boarding an airplane or whatever it is. I think any agreement you want to do, if you have a connection to this is me, you can just fundamentally change a lot of the interactions with businesses.
So it's a friction-free future.
It's yes.
Like just the paperwork goes away, and we get back 5% of our lives.
That's one part, and I think that the second, very fundamental. So that's kind of enabled by an identity, the ability to sign something digitally. That's this part. The other part, I think, is really the data ownership and the ability to share selectively and really create a lot of trust in any interaction, peer-to-peer or with companies.
Got it. So much less buying weird random stuff off eBay and discovering it's junk when it arrives. Yeah, okay. Well, that's a future I could believe in. Ian, are you ready to roll? Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.